Hello, AP World History. Welcome in tonight. We are about to do Unit 6 reading questions on imperialism. So when you get in here, make sure you drop a comment. Let me know that you're here. And we'll get started here in just a second. Unit 6 reading questions on imperialism. So when you get in, you don't want that up. Okay. All right, guys. So when you get in here, just let me know. Sorry about that. I forgot that I had it open in another window. Got so many windows open right now. Welcome in, guys. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are about to do imperialism. Okay, let's try that again. Having some tech issues tonight with my microphone. Anyways, we are about to do Unit 6 reading questions. Check them out in your notebook. They should be right there in Unit 6. We've already done industrialization, so we're working on colonialism in Africa and Asia tonight. Hey, Sam, welcome in. Good to see you. Drop a comment and let me know when you get here. Here's the questions that we're working on. We're going to be on page 879 of your textbook. I'm going to zoom out of this a little bit. There we go. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 questions. Hopefully we'll be able to get them done. We're going to go ahead and get started. And then if anybody else joins us, they can just hop right in. If you would like to put these on a Google Doc instead of trying to type them in here directly, that's fine. Totally okay. You can put them on a Google Doc. It's probably the easiest thing. And then you can either put the link in your assignments or in here with the reading questions, either one. I'll look both spots. Okay, our first question, question number 9 is, in what ways did the Industrial Revolution shape the character of 19th century European imperialism? I'm going to throw that in there real quick just so that it's right for next year. All right. So in what ways did Industrial Revolution shape this and kind of cause imperialism? So this would be really good for your context that's coming up for a DBQ that you may have to write on imperialism. We are on page 880. How's it going, Koala? Hey, Sean, welcome in. Good to see you guys. Drop me a hello when you get in here so I know who's listening. It's good to have you all in here. And if you have any questions as we're moving along here, just let me know, okay? All right, so we're going to start on that first question. We are on page 880 of your textbook. You're going to follow along here on the screen, or you can follow along in your textbook. Either one's fine. Make it as big as I possibly can. All right, here we go. So behind much of Europe's 19th century expansion lay the massive fact of its Industrial Revolution, a process that gave rise to new economic needs, many of which found solutions abroad. The enormous productivity of industrial technology and Europe's growing affluence now created the need for extensive raw materials and agricultural products. So one thing that you can put in there for that question is that because of the Industrial Revolution, just abbreviated IR, because of the IR, they needed raw materials and agricultural products. Put that in there right now. Hey, Haranya, welcome in. Good to have you guys. We are on question number 9, and we're putting this down. They need extensive raw materials and agricultural products. That goes with question number 9. Also, beside question number 9, you might want to put a little note to yourself that this could work for context for imperialism, which you may need soon. Hint it. All right. So these are some examples. So some evidence or some examples that you might be able to put into your context. You might want to write a couple of these down. Wheat from the Americas and southern Russia. Meat from Argentina. Bananas from Central America. Rubber from Brazil. Cocoa and palm oil from West Africa. Tea from Ceylon. Gold and diamonds from South Africa. This demand radically changed patterns of economic and social life in the countries of their origin. So there was a demand for these that is going to change the patterns of economic and social life. So society and economics in those places where they're coming from. And that we'll get into here in a little bit. I would just put a couple of those down. You don't necessarily need to write all of them, but just for notation later. Furthermore, Europe needed to sell its own products. One of the peculiarities, I can't say that word, of industrial capitalism was that it periodically produced more manufactured goods than its own people could afford to buy. So by 1840, for example, Britain was exporting 60% of its cotton cloth production, annually sending 200 million yards to Europe, 300 million yards to Latin America, and 145 million yards to India. So put down that not only were they getting products from other countries, but they're also exporting. So they're finding new markets in these new countries. Hey, Lana, I saw your brother the other day at the pharmacy, and he was like, "Did you have my sister as your student last year?" And I was like, "Who's your sister?" So anyway, full circle. I was like, "Oh yeah, I had her." So in my class, and I told him that you're my library assistant this year, but haven't really been able to take you up on that offer. Good to have you. I hope your year is going good. Okay, so there was a demand, and also they're selling their products. Let's go down to this next paragraph. Much the same could be said for capital. For European investors often found it more profitable to invest their money abroad than at home. So make a little note in that Europeans were investing money abroad in other countries. That's awesome, Lana. I thought I recognized him because I think he was in one of your videos that you did for me one time for an assignment. But, you know, with the masks, it's hard to tell. So I'm glad he told me who he was. Between 1910 and 1913, Britain was sending about half of its savings overseas as foreign investment. In 1914, it had some 3.7 billion pounds sterling invested abroad, about equally divided between Europe, North America, and Australia, and on the one hand, and Asia, Africa, and Latin America's on the other. So they were investing some of their profits. Wealthy Europeans also saw social benefits to foreign markets, which served to keep Europe's factories humming and its workers employed. The English imperialist Cecil Rhodes confided his fears to a friend. So Cecil Rhodes is one of the most famous imperialists. We'll see him in some of the political cartoons we're going to look at later. He says, "Yesterday I attended a meeting of the unemployed in London, and having listened to the wild speeches, which were nothing more than a scream for bread, I returned home convinced more than ever of the importance of imperialism. In order to save the 40 million inhabitants of the United Kingdom from a murderous civil war, the colonial politicians must open up new areas to absorb the excess population and create new markets for the products of the mines and factories. The British Empire is a matter of bread and butter. If you wish to avoid civil war, then you must become an imperialist." So he's basically saying, open up these new markets because the people of the United Kingdom need these new markets in order to be able to avoid, that's the word I'm looking for, in order to avoid a civil war. So thus imperialism promised to solve the class conflicts of an industrializing society while avoiding revolution or the serious redistribution of wealth. Basically, the rich are going to stay rich, but yet keep the poor employed as the laboring class because there's enough demand for the supply that's going out. Okay, but what made imperialism so broadly popular in Europe, especially in the last quarter of the 19th century, was the growth of mass nationalism. We talked about this today a little bit in your review. By 1871, the unification of Italy and Germany made Europe's already competitive international relations even more so, and much of this rivalry spilled over into the struggle for colonies or economic concessions in Asia and Africa. So on number 9, put something about mass nationalism in Europe, or Europe striving for nationalism. And then it says colonies and spheres of influence abroad became symbols of great power, status for a nation, and their acquisition was a matter of urgency, even if they possessed little immediate economic value. So they just wanted colonies more so for status, even if it wasn't going to help them economically. After 1875, it seemed to matter even to ordinary people whether some remote corner of Africa or some obscure Pacific island was in the British, French, or German hands. Imperialism, in short, appealed on economic and social grounds to the wealthy or ambitious, seemed politically and strategically necessary in the game of international power politics, and was emotionally satisfying to almost everyone. That was a potent mix indeed. So not only were the rich supporting this, but also the middle class and the laboring class. They were all kind of supporting this idea that we have to be the best European nation and have as many places under our control as possible. So put that down underneath nationalism, that everyone was supporting this idea that their country had to be the best. And this political cartoon is a great example of that. This is the British Empire being portrayed as an octopus and kind of having his tentacles stretched out to all these countries and having grasp on different colonies and how much power they have. There's a saying that says the sun never set on the British Empire. And that means that anywhere in the world, at some point, the sun was shining in the British Empire. And that was kind of like their claim to fame, that they had so many different places around the world. So if the industrial era made overseas expansion more desirable or even urgent, it also provided new means for achieving those goals. Steam-driven ships moving through the new Suez Canal, completed in 1869, allowed Europeans to reach distant Asian and African ports more quickly and predictably, and to penetrate interior rivers as well. The underwater telegraph made possible almost instant communication with far-flung outposts of the empire. The discovery of quinine to prevent malaria greatly reduced European deaths in the tropics, and breech-loading rifles and machine guns vastly widened the military gap between Europeans and everyone else. So definitely put down that the Industrial Revolution spurs this on because of the technology. And then grab one of those examples. Maybe write down about the Suez Canal. I'm going to show you where that's at. We're still on number 9. We're still on question number 9. As far as I know. I haven't looked at the questions. I need to do that. Okay, so the Suez Canal makes it possible. This is kind of a small picture. Let's see if I can make it bigger. Nope. There, okay. So the Suez Canal makes it possible to get through the Red Sea into the Mediterranean Sea. So you don't have to go all the way around Africa. And it really, really cuts that distance a lot. Plus, it gives them access to rivers that will take you into Africa deeper. So you can put that down as one of the examples of how the technology helps. It not only helps them build the Suez Canal, but they have steam-driven ships in order to travel on this through the Suez Canal. While you're writing that down, I'm going to look at the next question. All right, our next question is about change. What contributed to changing European views of Asians and Africans in the 19th century? So what was that change? What contributes to it? It says industrialization also occasioned a marked change in the way Europeans perceived themselves and others. So now they're going to answer your question. In earlier centuries, Europeans had defined others largely in religious terms. They were heathen, we were Christian. Even as they held on to this sense of religious superiority, Europeans nonetheless adopted many of the ideas and techniques of more advanced societies. they held many aspects of Chinese and Indian civilization in high regard, and they freely mixed and mingled with Asian and African elites and often married their women. Some even saw more technologically simple people as noble savages. So they're starting to mix a little bit more. Let's see what else it says. With the advent of the industrial age, however, Europeans developed a secular arrogance that fused with, or in some cases, replaced their notions of religious superiority. They had, after all, unlocked the secrets of nature, created a society of unprecedented wealth, and used both to produce unsurpassed military power. These became the criteria by which Europeans judged themselves and the rest of the world. By such standards, it's not surprising that their opinions of other cultures dropped sharply. So at first, before the Industrial Revolution, that's when they were kind of intermingling, and it's talked about, why did that change occur? Let's look at that one more time. So it says they adopted, because they were adopting ideas and techniques from these other societies, they were intermingling with some of the elites, but notice it was just the elites that they were mingling with, okay? Now they're going to start being a little bit more like high and mighty, or a little bit more superior, because of what's taking place here. It says the Chinese, who had been highly praised in the 18th century, were reduced in the 19th century to the image of John Chinaman, weak, cunning, obstinately conservative, and in large numbers a distinct threat, represented by the yellow peril in the late 19th century European thinking. African societies, which had been regarded even in the slave trade era as nations and their leaders as kings, were demoted in the 19th century eyes to the status of tribes led by chiefs as a means of emphasizing their primitive qualities. So, because of this reason right here, they think that they are starting to become superior. So you can put down that Europeans, are claiming that because they have unlocked secrets of nature and massed all this like wealth and military power, that they're superior. And then let's look and see what we can find more about this question. It says, increasingly, Europeans viewed the culture and achievements of Asian African peoples through the prism of the new kind of racism expressed now in terms of modern science. Although physical differences had often been a basis of fear or dislike, in the 19th century, Europeans increasingly used the prestige and apparatus of science to support their racial preferences and prejudice. I think it's henologists, I can't say that word either, or craniologists. They basically measured the size of the skull, and sometimes physicians used allegedly scientific methods and numerous instruments to classify the size and shape of human skulls, and concluded, not surprisingly, that those of whites were larger and therefore more advanced. 19th century biologists who classified the varieties of plants and animals applied these notions of rank to varieties of human beings as well. The result was a hierarchy of races, with the whites on top and the less developed child races beneath them. Race, in this view, determined human intelligence, moral development, and destiny. Race is everything, declared the British anatomist Robert Knox in 1850. Civilization depends on it. Furthermore, as the germ theory of disease took hold in 19th century Europe, it was accompanied by fears that contact with inferiors threatened the health and even the biological future of more advanced or superior peoples. So you can put down something like this idea of racial superiority starts to take hold, and Europeans believe because they're superior that they can't mix with inferior races. And also put down that inferior races are like children. They look at them like child races. You'll see that in some of the documents that we're going to read. Hello, Nan. I'm so glad you've arrived. We are on question number 10, Unit 6 reading questions. You've only missed one question, though, so you haven't missed very much. You can always go back and listen to it later. Okay, then it says, these ideas influenced how Europeans viewed their own global expansion. Almost everyone saw it as inevitable or natural outgrowth of a superior civilization. For many, though, this viewpoint was tempered with a genuine, if condescending, sense of responsibility to the weaker races that Europe was fated to dominate. So once again, it's the white man's burden that we were talking about today, that they have to go and help the weaker races. So put something down about that. It's the white man's burden. They have to help the weaker races. They have a duty. Right here it says, superior races have a right because they have a duty. So another one way of justifying it, right? They have a duty to civilize inferior races. That civilizing mission included bringing Christianity to the heathen, good government to disordered lands, and work discipline and production for the markets of lazy natives. So put down something about how they had the duty to bring Christianity, a better government, and discipline and production to the natives. Hey, Non, you know, that's a good accident to have. You accidentally did them. We did the first part of the ones about industrialization. We haven't done the second part together yet. These ones right here. This is the one we're on right here. But you might have already done them. And if you did, that's a happy accident. You might just want to review them a little bit. A harsher side to the ideology of imperialism derived from an effort to apply, or perhaps misapply, the evolutionary thinking of Charles Darwinism to an understanding of human societies. The key concept of this, social Darwinism, though not necessarily shared by Darwin himself, was the survival of the fittest, suggesting that European dominance inevitably involved the displacement or destruction of backward people or unfit races. So basically, Darwinism is that the survival of a species will depend on whether or not they are fit enough to survive. And social Darwinism is the survival of a race. And that the inferior races cannot survive without the superior race helping them. So referring to native peoples of Australia, a European bishop declared, everyone who knows a little about Aboriginal races is aware that those races, which are of a low type mentally, and who are at the same time weak in constitution, rapidly die out when their country comes to be occupied by a different race, much more vigorous, robust, and pushing than themselves. Now, that's not necessarily true, right? They're dying out because the superior race that's coming in is bringing in new diseases, is bringing in more military might, and they can't survive against that. But in his point of view, that's because they're inferior. Such views made imperialism, war, and aggression seem both natural and progressive, but they were predicted on the notion that weeding out weaker peoples of the world would allow the stronger to flourish. These were some of the ideas with which industrializing an increasingly powerful European confronted the people of Asia and Africa in the 19th century. So put down something about how this belief that the stronger would rule the weaker came from industrializing and the power that the Europeans had. Okay, moving right along. Our next question is, in what different ways was colonial rule established and in various parts of Africa and Asia? So, if the 16th and 17th century takeover of the Americas represented the first phase of European colonial conquest, the century and a half between 1750 and 1914 was a second and quite distinct round of that larger process. Now it was focused in Asia and Africa rather than in the Western Hemisphere, and it featured a number of new players such as Germany, Italy, Belgium, United States, and Japan, who were not at all involved in the earlier phases. While the Spanish and the Portuguese now had minor roles, in general, Europeans preferred informal control, which operated through economic penetration and occasional military intervention, but without a wholesale colonial takeover. So they weren't really setting up colonies per se to take over. They were just going in to have economic domination. Such a course was cheaper and less likely to provoke wars, but where rivalry with other European states made it impossible, or where local governments were unable or willing to cooperate, Europeans proved more than willing to undertake the expense and the risk of conquest and outright colonial rule. So it does happen in some places, but that wasn't their preference. That's basically what it's saying. The construction of these new European empires in Afro-Asia world, like empires everywhere, involved military force or the threat of it. Initially, the European military advantage lay in organization, drill and practice, and command structure. Increasingly in the 19th century, the Europeans also possessed overwhelmingly advantages in firepower, deriving from the recently invented repeating rifles and machine guns. So once again, just like with the Native Americans in America, the English and the Europeans still have better weaponry. So put down something to that effect, that they have more powerful weapons, which enables them to take over. Okay. And one of those, the automatic machine gun, is called the Maxim gun. So if you want to write that down for an example, this is how you spell it. And it says, nonetheless, Europeans had to fight, often long and hard, to create their new empires, as countless wars of conquest attest. In the end, though, they prevailed almost everywhere, largely against adversaries who did not have the Maxim gun, or in some cases, any guns at all. Thus were African and Asian people of all kinds incorporated within one or another of the European empires. Gathering and hunting bands in Australia, agricultural village societies or chiefdoms on Pacific islands, and in parts of Africa, pastoralists of Sahara and Central Asia, residents of states, large and small, and virtually everyone in the large and complex civilizations of India and Southeast Asia. All of them alike lost the political sovereignty and freedom of action they had previously exercised. That means they didn't have any political power anymore. For some, such as Hindus governed by the Muslim Mughal Empire, it was an exchange of one set of foreign rulers for another, but now all were subjects of a European colonial state. The passage to colonial status occurred in various ways. For the people of India and Indonesia, here's one part of your question because it asked about Asia. So here it is. Colonial conquest grew out of earlier interaction with European trading firms. Particularly in India, the British East India Company, rather than the British government directly, played the leading role in colonial takeover of South Asia. So put down a note about the British East India Company, and then put India beside it. This would be how the British would control India, not directly, but through the British East India Company. It says the fragmentation of the Mughal Empire and the absence of any overall sense of cultural or political unity both invited and facilitated European penetration. So what allowed it? Put down that the Mughal Empire was fragmented, or it was kind of split up. and they didn't have cultural or political unity. They didn't have cultural or political unity. A similar situation of many small and rival states assisted the Dutch acquisition of Indonesia. However, neither the British nor the Dutch had clear-cut plan for conquest. Rather, it evolved slowly as local authorities and European traders made and unmade a variety of alliances over roughly a century in India. In Indonesia, a few areas held out until the early 20th century. Okay. Then in Africa, for most of Africa, mainland Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, colonial conquest came later, in the second half of the 19th century, and rather more abruptly and deliberately than in India or Indonesia. So it was more deliberate in Africa. So put down that the colonialism in Africa was more deliberate. Then it says the scramble for Africa, for example, pitted half a dozen European powers against one another as they partitioned the entire continent among themselves in only about 25 years. European leaders themselves were surprised by the intensity of their rivalries and the speed with which they acquired huge territories about which they knew very little. The process involved endless but peaceful negotiation among the competing great powers about who would get what, and extensive and bloody military action, sometimes lasting decades, to make their control effective on the ground. It took the French 16 years to conquer the recently created West African Empire led by Samori Touré. We'll talk about him a little bit later next week. I was going to see if there was a map up there, but there isn't. Of Africa anyway. Among the most difficult to subdue were those decentralized societies without any formal state structure. In such cases, Europeans confronted no central authority with which they could negotiate or that they might decisively defeat. It was a matter of village by village conquest against extended residents. As late as 1925, one British official commented on the process as it operated in central Nigeria. He said, "I shall, of course, go on walloping them." Walloping? I think that's the word. Until they surrender. It's a rather piteous sight watching a village being knocked to pieces. And I wish there was some other way, but unfortunately there isn't. Another very difficult situation for the British lay in South Africa, where they were initially defeated by a Zulu army in 1879 at the Battle of Ishalwana, and 20 years later in what became known as the Boer War. Put down that this is talking about resistance in Africa. So for resistance, we have Samori Touré. So make a little note that says resistance. And Samori Touré, that's in West Africa. We'll talk more about him next week. And then also put down the Boer Wars. Where is it at? In South Africa. There's South Africa, and I don't see the Boer Wars. Oh, here it is. As also resistance. The Boers, white descendants of the earlier Dutch settlers in South Africa, fought bitterly for 3 years before succumbing to the British forces. Perhaps the great disparity in military forces made the final outcome of European victory inevitable. But the conquest of Africa was intensely contested. So there was a lot more resistance in Africa than in other parts of the world. It's not to say there wasn't resistance in other part of the world, because there was, but they're just saying that there was more in Africa. Here's the map of how things were divided up. So you can check that out later. The South Pacific territories of Australia and New Zealand, both of which were taken over by the British during the 19th century, were more similar to the early colonization of North America than to the contemporary patterns of Asian and African conquest. In both places, conquest was accompanied by large-scale European settlements and diseases that reduced native numbers. So put a heading down for Australia and New Zealand. They will get their area not by conquest, but by settler colonies. And they will defeat with settlement and diseases. You'll also want to write down this word. This is Aboriginal. That means that those were the original people in Australia and New Zealand. Aboriginal Australians constituted only about 2.4% of their country's population in the early 21st century, and the indigenous Maori comprised a minority of about 15% in New Zealand. With the exception of Hawaii, nowhere else in the 19th century colonial world were existing populations so decimated and overwhelmed as they were in Australia and New Zealand. Unlike these remote areas, most of Africa and Asia shared with Europe a broadly similar disease environment, and so was less susceptible to the pathogens of the conquerors. So remember at the beginning of the year, we talked about germs, guns, and steel. We talked about how the Europeans were coming into the New World, and they were decimating those populations because those populations didn't have immunity to the diseases. Similar thing happens in Australia and New Zealand. Whereas in Africa and Asia, they had immunity because they had domesticated animals and they had contact with the Europeans. The Aborigines in Australia and New Zealand had not had that contact. That's what they're talking about there. Elsewhere, other variations on the theme of imperial conquest unfolded. The Western expansion of the United States, for example, overwhelmed Native American populations and involved the country in an imperialist war with Mexico. Seeking territory for white settlement, the United States practiced a policy of removing and sometimes almost exterminating Indian peoples. On the reservations to which they confined and in boarding schools to which many of their children were removed, reformers sought to civilize the remaining Native Americans, eradicating tribal life and culture under the slogan, "Kill the Indian and save the man." That you'll learn a little bit more in depth next year when you talk about American history. But it was an awful time frame in our history of when they were just basically getting rid of the Native American population in any way they could, putting them on reservations, putting their children in boarding school. They would just take the children from the families, and the children endured horrible treatment in these boarding schools as they underwent trying to get their culture out of them almost. So you can put something down about the United States imperialized and kicked Native Americans off their land, putting them on reservations and in boarding schools. And then we have Japan. Japan's takeover of Taiwan and Korea bore marked similarities to European actions, as that East Asian nation joined the imperialist club. Russian penetration of Central Asia brought additional millions under European control as the Russian Empire continued to its earlier territorial expansion. Filipinos acquired new colonial rulers when the United States took over from Spain following the Spanish-American War of 1898. Some 13,000 freed U.S. slaves seeking greater freedom than was possible at home migrated to West Africa, where they became, ironically, a colonized elite in the land they called Liberia. Ethiopia and Siam were notable for avoiding the colonization to which their neighbors succumbed. Those countries' military and democratic skills, their willingness to make modest concession to the European, and the rivalries of the imperialists all contributed to those exceptions to the rule and the takeover of those places. So you can put down something about Japan takes over Taiwan and Korea. Russia takes Central Asia. U.S. gains the Philippines. And then put down that Ethiopia and Thailand are able to stay uncolonized. The reasons they could stay uncolonized is because they had military and diplomatic skills, so they had good government skills, and they made some concessions to the Europeans. They didn't completely have to have it their own way. Like, they were kind of worked with the Europeans. That's what that means. These broad patterns of colonial conquest dissolved into thousands of separate encounters as Asian and African societies were confronted with decisions about how to respond to encroaching European power in the context of their local circumstances. Many initially sought to enlist Europeans in their own internal struggles for power or their external rivalries with neighboring states or peoples. As pressures mounted and European demands escalated, some tried to play off imperial powers against one another. While others resorted to military action, many societies were sharply divided between those who wanted to fight and those who believed that resistance was futile. After extended resistance against French aggression, the 19th century Vietnamese Emperor Tu Duc argued with those who wanted the struggle to go on. Do you really wish to confront such a power with a pack of our cowardly soldiers? It would be like mounting on an elephant's head or caressing a tiger's tail. With what you presently have, do you really expect to dissolve the enemy's rifles into air or chase his battleships into hell? So basically, they just did not have enough military power to stand up against the Europeans. All right, what's our next question? Number 12, why might subject people choose to cooperate with colonial regime? What might prompt them to a violent rebellion? That might have already been answered. Nope, I think it's right here. All right, so under European rule, we're going to skip that part and go on to this next part so we can answer that question. Although violence was a prominent feature of colonial life, both during conquest and after, various groups and many individuals willingly cooperated with colonial authorities to their own advantage. Many men found employment, status, and security in European-led armed forces. So why would they cooperate? Because they find employment, status, and security. They cooperated because they found employment, status, and security. Then it says the shortage and expense of European administrators and the difficulties of communicating across cultural boundaries made it necessary for colonial rulers to rely heavily on a range of local I cannot talk. Basically, they're hiring locals to be like the middlemen for them. Thus, Indian princes, Muslim emirs, and African rulers, often from elite or governing families, found it possible to retain much of their earlier status and privileges, while gaining considerable wealth by exercising authority, legally and otherwise, at the local level. For example, in French West Africa, an area 8 times the size of France, and with a population of about 15 million in the late 1930s, the colonial state consisted of just 385 French administrators and more than 50,000 African chiefs. Thus, colonial rule rested on and reinforced the most conservative segments of Asia and African societies. So put down that especially the elite in societies were given governing roles. Especially the elite in societies were given governing roles. Both colonial governments and private missionary organizations had an interest in promoting a measure of European education. So they're also giving education. From this process arose a small Western educated class whose members served the colonial state, European businesses, and Christian missions as teachers, clerks, translators, and lower level administrators. So the kids that they're educating will later grow up and have roles in the education system. A few will even receive higher education abroad and return home as lawyers, doctors, engineers, and journalists. As colonial governments and business enterprises became more sophisticated, Europeans increasingly depended on Western educated class at the expense of the more traditional elites. So they're almost creating a new class of people. If colonial rule enlisted the willing cooperation of some, it provoked the bitter opposition of many others. Thus, periodic rebellions, both large and small, erupted in colonial regimes everywhere. The most famous among them was the Indian Rebellion of 1857 to 1858, which was triggered by the introduction into the colony's military force a new cartridge smeared with animal fat from cows and pigs. Because Hindus venerated cows and Muslims regarded pigs as unclean, both groups viewed the innovation as a plot to render them defiled and convert them to Christianity. So normally the Muslims and Hindus didn't agree, but on this they did. And this is, it's also called the Sepoy Rebellion. So you want to put that down in your notes. It can be called the Indian Rebellion or the Sepoy Rebellion. And I just put it in the chat so you know how to spell it. The reason that they were combined on this is because Hindus honor cows and Muslims regard pigs as unclean, so they can't have that in their body. And they had to, in order to use the cartridge, they had to rip it off with their mouth, and it was possible that that fat would get into their mouth. And they look at this as, you're trying to defile us and convert us to Christianity. So put down something along the lines that the Hindus and the Muslims were united in not liking the new policy of having their cartridges smeared with animal fat. Behind this incident were many groups of people with a whole series of grievances generated by the British colonial presence. Local rulers who had lost power, and landlords derived of their estates or their rent, peasants overtaxed and exploited by urban money lenders, and landlords alike, unemployed weavers displaced by machine-manufactured textile, and religious leaders outraged by missionary preaching. So they not only was it the military that didn't like this, but they also had backing from other people that had been displaced from their jobs by machinery or overtaxed or exploited. It says a mutiny among Indian troops in Bengal triggered the rebellion, which soon spread to other regions of the colony and other social groups. Soon much of India was aflame. Some rebel leaders presented their cause as an effort to revive an almost vanished Mughal empire and thereby attracted support from those with strong resentments against the British. Although it was crushed in 1858, the rebellion greatly widened the racial divide in colonial India and eroded British tolerance for those they viewed as Niger natives who had betrayed their trust. It was made the British, or it made the British more conservative and cautious about deliberately trying to change Indian society for fear of provoking another rebellion. Moreover, it convinced the British government to assume direct control over India, ending the era of the British East India Company rule of the subcontinent. So the result is Britain tightens up their rule. But they also didn't want to provoke another rebellion, so they were more cautious about the guidelines that they would put in place. They tightened their rule, but they were more cautious about the guidelines that they put in place. Okay. Our next question is, what was distinctive about European colonial empires of the 19th century? Distinctive means different. What is something that sets them apart? So keep that word in your mind. If you ever have to write a difference essay, you can use that word, distinctive. On one level, European colonial empires were but the latest in a very long line of imperial creations, all of which had enlisted cooperation and experienced resistance from their subject peoples. But the 19th century European version of empires was distinctive in several remarkable ways. So here they are. Get ready. One was prominence of race in distinguishing leaders, rulers, and the ruled, as the high tide of scientific racism in Europe coincided with the acquisition of Asia and African colonies. So they're going to make sure that race distinguishes the rulers from the ruled using scientific racism. So put down something about how they use scientific racism to distinguish the rulers from the ruled. In East Africa, for example, white men are expected to be addressed as master, whereas Europeans regularly called African men boys. So they're having that distinction between who's ruling and who's the ruler. Education for colonial subjects was limited and skewed toward political subjects rather than scientific and literary studies, which were widely regarded as inappropriate for the primitive mind of natives. So they kept education very controlled. Particularly affected by European racism were those whose Western education and aspirations most clearly threatened the racial divide. Europeans were exceedingly reluctant to allow even the most highly educated Asians and Africans to enter the higher ranks of colonial civil service. So they were worried about that if they had too much education. A proposal in 1883 to allow Indian judges to hear cases involving whites provoked outrage and massive demonstrations among European inhabitants of India. Yes, Sam. Yes, Indian nationalism is created because of this. Absolutely. And Gandhi was a big proponent to all of this. In those colonies that had a large European settler population, the pattern of racial separation was much more pronounced than in places such as Nigeria, which had few permanently settled whites. The most extreme case was South Africa, where a large European population and widespread use of African labor in mines and industries brought blacks and whites into closer and more prolonged contact than elsewhere. The racial fears that were aroused resulted in extraordinary efforts to establish race as a legal, not just a customary feature of South African society. This racial system provided for separate homelands, separate education system, residential areas, public facilities, and much more. It was eventually known as apartheid. So you want to write down this word. It was the separation of white and black people. Apartheid. And it was set up by white South Africans in an attempt to create an industrializing economy based on the cheap African labor, while also limiting African social and political integration. So they were it was kind of like keeping them in the low salary area, without allowing them a lot of say in things. And if you have not read the book Born a Crime, it's by Trevor Noah. Amazing. Just absolutely really, really good. We have it in the library. If you're in person, you can come check it out. But it's called Born a Crime. And of course, you know, he's a comedian, so it's going to be a little bit funny. But it also talks about this time frame and how he felt growing up in apartheid, being half black and half white. It's very interesting. All right, next paragraph says, a further distinctive feature, so here's another difference, of the 19th century European empires lay in the extent to which colonial states were able to penetrate the societies they governed. Centralized tax collecting bureaucracies, new means of communication and transportation, imposed changes in landholding patterns, integration of colonial economies into global network of exchange, public health and sanitation measures, and activity of missionaries. All this touched the daily lives of many people far more deeply than the earlier empires. So put down that another distinction is how deeply they penetrate into society. The Europeans, that is. How deeply the Europeans penetrate into society. How far they go with the control. So this is key right here. Not only were European foreign rulers, but they also bore the seeds of a very different life. So they're changing the culture. So not only did they rule, but they changed the culture as well. It won't let me highlight all of that, but you get the gist. Not only did they rule, but they changed the culture as well. They were part of that changing culture. 19th century European coloners were extraordinary as well in their penchant for counting and classifying their subject people. With the assistance of anthropologists and missionaries, colonial governments collected a vast amount of information, sought to organize it scientifically, and used it to manage the unfamiliar, complex, varied, and fluctuating societies that they governed. In India, the British found in classical texts and Brahmin ideology an idealized description of the caste system based on the notion of four ranked and unchanging varnas, which made it possible to bring order out of the immense complexity and variety of caste as it actually operated. Thus, the British invented and appropriated a Brahmin version of the traditional India that they favored and sought to preserve, while scorning as non-Indian the new elite educated in European schools and enthusiastic about Western ways of life. This view of India reflected the great influence of the Brahmins on British thinking and clearly served the interest of this Indian upper class. So what this is saying is they kind of took bits and pieces of the culture that they wanted to keep. And one of the things that they liked was the caste system that India had. And let's see. They they would look down on the parts of India that they didn't like, and they used that excuse of the caste system as why they were doing it. Likewise, within African colonies, Europeans identified and sometimes invented distinct tribes, each with its own clearly defined territory, language, customs, and chief. The notion of the tribal Africa expressed the Western view that African societies were primitive or backward, which would help them justify it, right? Representing an earlier stage of human development. It was also a convenient idea, for it reduced the enormous complexity and fluidity of African societies to a more manageable state, and thus made colonial administration easier. So put down that they're taking away some culture, but they're also allowing some to stay, whatever fits their agenda, basically. Okay, and then it talks about gender. It says, gender too entered into European efforts to define both themselves and their newly acquired subject people. European colonizers, mostly male, took pride in their active masculinity while defining the conquered races as soft, passive, and feminine. Indian Bengali men, wrote a British official in 1892, are disqualified for political enfranchisement. They can't vote. By the possession of essentially feminine characteristics. They're basically women, that's what he's saying. By linking the inferiority of women with that of people of color, gender, ideology, and race prejudice were joined in support of colonial rule. But the intersection of race, gender, and empire was complex and varied. European men in the colonies often viewed their own women as the bearers and emblems of civilization, upholding the moral dignity of the white community amid the darkness of the inferior people. As such, they had to be above reproach in sexual matters, protected against the alleged lusts of native men by their separation from local African and Asian societies. Furthermore, certain colonized peoples, such as the Sikhs and the Gurkhas in India, the Kamba in Kenya, and the Hausa in Nigeria, were gendered as masculine or martial races and targeted for recruitment into British military or police forces. So basically, they're using this ideology however they want, wherever they want. Because like in India, they're saying, oh no, they're too feminine to vote or be part of the government, and women can't, do that. But in some places in Africa and in other places of India, the Sikhs and the Gurkhas, they were allowed to be in the British military. So basically, whatever fit their agenda, that's what they did. Excuse me. Finally, European colonial policies contradicted their own core values and their practices at home to an unusual degree. While 19th century Britain and France were becoming more democratic, their colonies were essentially dictatorships, offering perhaps order and stability, but certainly not democratic government, because few colonial subjects were participating citizens. So put down that the colonies were run opposite of what the home country was run. The colonies are run opposite of what the home country is run. In that the colonies are more like dictatorships, not democracies. Then it says, empire, of course, was wholly at odds with European notions of national independence and ranked racial classifications, went against the grain of both Christian and Enlightenment ideas of human equality. Furthermore, many Europeans were distinctly reluctant to encourage within their colonies the kind of modernization, such as urban growth, industrialization, individual values, religious skepticism that was sweeping their own society. So they kind of didn't want the colonies to modernize the way that they had. They feared that this kind of social change, often vilified as detribalization, would encourage unrest and challenge colonial rule. So they were afraid that these modern ideas would come up, that it would challenge their rule, which is probably correct. As a model for social development, they much preferred traditional rural society with its established authorities and social hierarchies through shorn of abuses such as slavery and sati, which is widow burning. That's when a husband dies, the widow has to jump on his fire that's burning the body and basically commit suicide. That was going on in India. Such contradictions, between what Europeans preached at home and what they practiced in the colonies became increasingly apparent to many Asians and Africans and played a major role in undermining the foundation of colonial rule in the 20th century. So put down that because the Europeans were so hypocritical in how they were ruling, that would eventually undermine their rule. Because they were so hypocritical in how they were ruling, that would eventually undermine their rule. All right. So you guys have 4 questions left. And the next one is, how did the policies of colonial states change economics? And that one is right down here. So put a note beside that question. That is on page 893. Oops, sorry. And then your next question. Where's that at? Is on page 895 about the crops. And then if you just follow this through, you should find the other ones. Let's see, that's about wage labor. How did African men? So just keep reading through here. This goes to 907. Here's the one about the women. That's on 899. Then you have about 7 more pages. So you have about 10 more pages to read by yourself. That's not too bad. Does anybody have any questions before we wrap this show up? All right, guys, if you don't have any other questions, your responsibility then is the last 4 questions, and those aren't due until the 13th. Make sure you're working on that practice DBQ. If you are in A day, I will talk about that tomorrow. B day, you already have it, so let me know if you need any help over the weekend, okay? All right, guys, I will talk to you later. If you're at A day, I'll see you tomorrow, and if you're a B day, have a great weekend. Thanks for joining.